Hello, everyone. I'd like to thank you for joining us today for the Qualitative Methods Masterclass webinar series. Today, we're going to be hearing from Dr. Linda Liebenberg, and her talk will be on Photovoice as more than just an arts and crafts project, rigorous approaches to thematic analysis and dissemination. So Dr. Linda Liebenberg is a leading researcher and evaluator in the field of youth social epidemiology with a core interest in children and youth with complex needs. Her work explores the promotion of positive youth development and mental health using a social determinants of health model through both equivalent evaluation of service provision and research of youth experiences. As a key component of this work, Linda reflects critically on both best ways in which to conduct research and evaluations with children and their communities, including service providers. These approaches include participatory image-based methods, sophisticated longitudinal qualitative designs, and the design of measurement instruments used with children and youth. Linda has developed consulting and collaborative relationships with many international community-based organizations, including Right to Play, the World Bank, and the World Health Organization. She has presented globally on culturally and contextually meaningful approaches to promoting positive psychosocial outcomes of children and youth, as well as the ways in which they can be researched and evaluated. Her publications include the co-edited volumes Researching Resilience and Resilience in Action with Michael Unger, and Youth Resilience and Culture, Commonalities and Complexities. Linda, it's great to have you here today, and you can go ahead and begin.
Thanks, Yvette. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. Before starting, I just want to say thank you to IIQM and ATLAS.ti for making this series possible. And I also want to send out a very big thank you to the amazing young people I've been privileged to work with during the past 4 years, youth and research assistants, who have been so willing to share the research journey that I will be talking about today. And before we go any further, I just want to share my screen. Hopefully we have some traction there. Correct. Photovoice has gained immense popularity since Caroline Wang and Marianne Burris first introduced us to it in 1992 as Photonovella. With this growing popularity is a growing concern around the rigor in the method's application. As Gubrium and Harper so eloquently warn us, it is important not to work from the naive perspective that participation is always liberatory. And it is with this in mind that I come to you with today's presentation. If we are to promote the aims of critical theory, post-colonial theory, social justice research, and so forth, we have an ethical imperative as researchers to ensure that the ways in which we engage research with communities honors their wisdom and expertise. Part of honoring this wisdom and expertise requires us to ensure that we facilitate a critical reflection on structurally embedded experiences, and that the knowledge emerging from this reflection is given both a platform from which to be voiced, and perhaps more importantly, is amplified in ways that are heard. And so, with this in mind, today I will be reviewing the theoretical underpinning of both participatory action research, or PAR, and Photovoice, where a focus on PAR is necessary given that Photovoice is situated within this broader framework. After reviewing the Photovoice process, I will explain thematic analysis and why I think this is a good fit with participatory research approaches, Photovoice in particular. I will then briefly explain the Spaces and Places research program as an example study in which I will use to walk you through the analysis process and approaches to dissemination. So we begin with the theoretical underpinnings of participatory action research, or PAR. There are 4 essential elements to PAR: participation by stakeholders in a process aimed at the advancement of knowledge through a systemic research process that results in action on the part of stakeholders and that leads to social change. A central component of participation is engagement in democratic processes, which translates into research with people at all stages of the project. The key premise is that research should be done with people and not on or for people. That said, in order to participate fully, People need to know and understand the complexity of issues. The implication for research, then, is that if you sell short on methods and rigor, you sell short on unpacking the complexity of social concerns, and in this way sell short on participation. Simultaneously, however, if the methods and related process remain inaccessible to the community due to their complexity, full engagement is again not possible. Because of this, we as academics and researchers are obligated to re-present research methods, to find ways of ensuring that the implementation of research methods remains rigorous, while also establishing engaging and accessible processes that enable the communities we work with. While many approaches to participatory research do reflect the successful reworking of data collection approaches, we as researchers sometimes fall short in terms of analysis. Many dissemination projects reflect clearly the data gathering process, but fail to clearly articulate how data was analyzed in a rigorous yet participatory way. Equally important are considerations of knowledge mobilization, the ways in which new knowledge generated through PAR is presented and to whom it is presented. Moving on to the research aspect of PAR then, it is critical to realize that because research is situated in PAR does not mean it is somehow watered down or reduced. It remains a rigorous process of knowledge production that results in peer-reviewed outputs, the marker of which is currently publications. In this way, it is separate from action learning aimed at solving problems through local understanding. Finally, action is intended to bring about social change. If the action is limited to a public exhibit, for example, it has not necessarily been fully developed. It may not reach those stakeholders who hold power over resources and with whom critical dialogue needs to take place. Similarly, an art-style exhibition does not necessarily ensure that the intended meaning of community researchers has been communicated to knowledge users. And finally, even if relevant stakeholders are present and messages are clearly communicated, what guarantee is there that these messages will be taken seriously? These types of issues may have been addressed, but they may also not have been. In order for social change to be initiated, relevant actors need to be present. Ways will have to be found to ensure that they understand the content of the dissemination products. And finally, some social players, policymakers for example, will require that the evidence placed before them is reliable and valid. We may object to these terms, but we do need to be cognizant of their existence, positioning, and role in the action for change process. They hold important implications for the social change aspect of Photovoice, and as such have important implications for the research component of the process. If we want change to be meaningful, we have to give critical and full consideration to the ways in which participation occurs and the depth that is achieved in this process. These three components of participation, research, and action are brought together through a collaborative effort of researchers and populations in order to inform a rigorous body of knowledge and related social change, usually within a social justice agenda. And so we can start to see that the ethical, social, and research implications of PAR are complex and require great care and skill in their meaningful application. With these foundational components of PAR in mind, we now turn our attention to the theoretical underpinnings of Photovoice. Photovoice builds on the principles of feminist theory, Paulo Freire's critical pedagogy, and photography. In order to fully understand the process of Photovoice, we have to understand the theory underlying it. In their work with women living in rural farming communities of Yunnan Province, China, Wang and Burris drew on the work of Ruth Frankenberg, reviewing the social construction of race and gender amongst white women, in situating photonovela, or Photovoice as it has become known. It is especially Frankenberg's conclusion that the private, the daily, and the apparently trivial in women's activities come to be understood as shared rather than individual experiences, and as socially and politically constructed, that resonates with the critical and social justice approaches to research. The important point here is that Wang and Burris sought a means of exploring the apparently trivial, or the taken for granted in daily lived experience, and uncovering the social and political constructions around these experiences that maintain the status quo of marginalization, oppression, and so forth. Additionally, they sought a method that was collaborative and inclusive of women, and that reflected a nothing for us without us approach that resulted in liberation. These sorts of inclusive, reflective, and change-orientated approaches were, of course, reflected in the work of Paulo Freire. Freire sought to establish an egalitarian power shift in educational process, situating students and teachers as equals, colleagues, if you will, where they collaboratively co-created knowledge through a process of collective introspection and dialogue. To do this, he made use of images, pictures, which he believed functioned as a mirror to communities, reflecting everyday social and political realities that impacted and shaped people's lives. Freire believed that through a collective process of reflection, introspection, and discussion of images, communities were able to uncover the social and political constructions that maintained their marginalization, and in the case of the communities with which he was working, their exploitation. They were in essence able to achieve critical consciousness of their socio-political positioning. Here Freire identified 3 levels of consciousness. The first is the magical level, where people accept their social positioning and status quo. At this level, attitudes of helplessness and behaviors of passive adaptation actively contribute to continued oppression by dominant groups. At the naive level, individuals perceive and interpret their social situation as basically sound but corrupt. However, rather than analyzing and addressing more fundamental issues of injustice, they may engage in horizontal or lateral violence, blaming their peers for the social reality of their lives. When individuals achieve critical consciousness, however, they become aware of both the ways in which contexts are structured to maintain oppression and of the ways in which their own assumptions and behaviors contribute to these oppressive systems. Individuals with critical consciousness become aware of their own responsibility for choices that either contribute to the maintenance or alteration of social structures, and can start to engage in processes of social change. This third level of critical consciousness is necessary in order to facilitate meaningful change. With feminist and critical pedagogy frameworks in mind, we turn our attention to photographs. Why is it that researchers are drawn to the use of images? For several decades now, the argument has been well established that images can serve as signifiers of culture, highlighting values and expectations of individuals as well as groups. This is because images are not unequivocal records of reality. There is little that is literal about the image. Again, for decades, authors have argued that images, including photographs, have no meaning in and of themselves. They take up meaning from the contexts in which they are inscribed, or which we inscribe to them. How images are created and the sense viewers make of them depends fundamentally upon cultural assumptions, personal knowledge, and the context in which the picture is generated and presented. How images are seen and read is shaped by the values, beliefs, assumptions, and experiences that both photographer and viewer bring to them. Essentially, because images are argued to be visual representations of subjective experiences rather than objective statements, the exploration of visual meanings not only helps us see, but also asks us to slow down and consider, to think about what it is we are seeing and what it is we don't see and why. And so it is these collective principles and theories that inform the Photovoice process. And again, as Gubrium and Harper say, Photovoice is a means of not only collecting rich narrative data, but also of going beyond a narrow focus on discourse into the realm of perception, experience, and spatial and embodied ways of knowing the world. And so with these principles of photography, critical pedagogy, and feminism in mind, Wang and Burris developed Photovoice. Explaining the contextualizing and narrative components of this participatory process, Wang and Burris explained the acronym VOICE in Photovoice as voicing our individual and collective experience. Photovoice uses reflective photography to enable people to record and reflect community strengths and concerns, promote knowledge and critical dialogue about community issues and their impact on individuals through group discussion of images, and reach and inform policymakers to bring about change. And it is these three aspects that make up the three components of the Photovoice process. The Photovoice process entails the production of photographs by participants. Images are then collectively interpreted, where resulting findings and knowledge lead to action. Situated against the larger background of the theory that informs this method, however, we see that the photographs produced by participants themselves become the catalysts of reflective stories in which the meanings and interpretations that emerge are elaborated on by the collective group. Put differently, there is a shared interpretation of personal experiences in which meaning is both embedded and from which meaning is co-constructed, exploring why images are important, what is going on, why this is, what it is reflective of, and what can we do about it. Participants come to understand the larger social processes and conditions in which these experiences are embedded, are better able to highlight what is needed to alter these situations, and existing resources and needed resources can be identified. In identifying the themes emerging from this process of co-construction, participants are able to generate theories, knowledge. At the same time, they are able to both identify and understand more critically the issues confronting their community, resources available, and action that can and needs to be taken. Both the developed knowledge and the awareness of resources become a catalyst for social change that communities can draw on. Thought of in this way, not only is the platform for voice crucial to this process, but so too is ensuring that voices are heard. And so the Photovoice process. The first component of the Photovoice process generally involves reaching consensus on the research topic and providing training in photography and research ethics. Training need not focus on how to make artistic images, but should definitely focus at least on the technicalities of how to make images. Following this, participants produce images individually or as a group and select those that will shape further discussions. To facilitate group discussion of photographs, Wang and Burris developed the Showed Guide as a prompt for the analysis process of Component 2. What do you see here? What is really happening here? How does this relate to our lives? Why does this concern, situation, or strength exist? How can we become empowered through our new understanding? And what can we do? While many research teams elect not to use these questions in their strict format, Showed does reflect the aspects necessary to get at the dynamics of issues, the social, economic, and political contexts that support ideologies and control the resources and strategies necessary to bring about change. As such, researchers can use Showed as a guide to facilitate the discussion, moving from the more superficial towards the larger situatedness of the issue under investigation. By integrating these questions into our analysis framework, we can use the analysis process to A, understand the deeper structural issues in which experiences are embedded and the processes that maintain or uphold the status quo, and B, the actions that can be taken to bring about meaningful change as well as the resources available to engage in these change processes. While this first research component relates more to the development of knowledge and theory, the second point relates more to the dissemination and action component. The third component of Photovoice relates to dissemination. Authors of Photovoice projects often write about giving participants voice. While this is an important and central aspect of Photovoice, what is less emphasized, or perhaps even considered, is the extent to which that voice is heard and results in action. In order to better ensure that Photovoice projects add to both the knowledge base and contribute to change, it is helpful to consider who are the actors necessary to bring about change. How can they be engaged in the change process? And what information do they need to do this? Of course, in order to ensure that the information disseminated is embedded in a rigorous process that has produced valid and reliable data, able to withstand scrutiny and questioning, we need to give attention to the analysis process. Because of this, the remainder of today's presentation focuses on the use of thematic analysis within the Photovoice process. Guest, McQueen, and Amy explained thematic analysis as a rigorous, inductive means of identifying implicit and explicit themes in data. The model they present blends aspects of grounded theory, interpretivism, and phenomenology, supporting an applied approach to analysis. In this way, their work aligns with the intent of Photovoice to develop knowledge through the generation of themes and related theories. They explain further that the primary concern of thematic analysis is with presenting stories and experiences voiced by participants as accurately and comprehensively as possible. In this way, thematic analysis aligns with the goal of Photovoice of amplifying participant voice, reflecting lived experience. And finally, Guest and colleagues argue that thematic analysis is good for team research and can be used to study topics other than individual experience. This aspect aligns with the collaborative and collective aspects of Photovoice. For these various reasons, thematic analysis lends itself to data analysis in Photovoice, and as will be shown, is easily adaptable to participatory settings, such as those of Photovoice. Braun and Clark outline 6 steps to thematic analysis, which include familiarization with data, generating initial codes, identifying themes that reflect collections of codes, reviewing data to understand and explain the meaning and dynamics of themes, maintaining rigor through intercoder agreement, and producing the final report. Steps 2 through 4 can also be thought of in the following way. Once we are familiar with the data, we begin coding. Once the coding structure is in place, we identify themes that reflect collections of these codes. We then review the data to understand the dynamics of themes, the interrelationships between them. This process may or may not result in theory development. Before demonstrating this process in action, I'm going to provide some background to the study that will stand in as an example. Spaces and Places seeks to understand how the social, relational, and physical spaces around youth promotes their civic and cultural engagement, and how this engagement in turn promotes positive and healthy life outcomes. The study expands on the work of researchers such as Chandler and Lalonde, Fleming and Ledergar, Kermeyer, Brass and Tate, Kermeyer, Simpson and Cargo, Lope, Redding and Wien, and Mignon and O'Neill, who have all demonstrated the connection between increased cultural engagement and improved life outcomes for Aboriginal peoples in Canada. Chandler and Lalonde's work, for example, has shown how these connections reduce rates of suicide amongst First Nations youth. In a context where rates of suicide amongst First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples is significantly higher than amongst non-Aboriginal peoples, understanding how to facilitate cultural engagement is critical. In an effort to understand the ways in which communities can facilitate the cultural engagement of youth, Spaces and Places has taken place in 3 Aboriginal communities of Canada. 2 communities in Labrador, one predominantly Inuit and one predominantly Métis, and 1 First Nations community in Nova Scotia, namely a Mi'kmaq community. In each of these sites, the research has taken place in partnership with local government departments providing mental health services to the community. In total, 25 youth have participated in the study and were between the ages of 12 and 18 when the study began. While the study made use of various participatory visual methods, the focus today is on the photographic component. For this, each youth spent a week engaged in a reflective photography process. Each youth individually made images of their community, places they felt safe and connected, and places they felt unsafe and disconnected. Each youth selected approximately 4 images to share in a focus group process. The data generated with these images was then analyzed by youth using thematic analysis. And so, onto the process. To familiarize all youth with the base data, we began the data analysis session by making analog Facebook pages where youth could provide information about themselves, their perceptions of their community, and their images. These pages were then used throughout the course of the data analysis process as a space where youth could post comments to each other and post updates on thoughts and questions. Once everyone had arrived, set up their Facebook pages, and connected over dinner, each youth shared their photos with the rest of the group, explaining what the image was of and why they made it. We then gathered and discussed the images and initial points raised in more detail in a focus group style discussion. Research assistants facilitated this discussion, asking for more explanation on issues and taking detailed notes. Following focus group discussions of photos, reviewing what we see, we used community mapping exercises to explore in more depth what it is that is actually happening in these images. We began with individual community maps, taking approximately 5 minutes to map out spaces, then worked in small groups for approximately 10 minutes, and finally in the full group for a longer and deeper discussion. We used this process to begin digging deeper into why does this concern, situation, or strength exist. We used community mapping as maps related to the issue of spaces and places that make youth feel they belong. As energizers, we used lifesaver sweets or candies to ask the question, who is a lifesaver in your community? And licorice laces tangled around the youth to ask, who do you go to in a tangle? Responses and thoughts were posted on Facebook pages, and again these questions and activities were related to the overall question of the study, relational spaces that make youth feel they belong and are safe. We used body maps to situate youth in relationships and community spaces, thinking about what a young person needs to be happy and healthy. Groups of youth had the opportunity to present their maps back to the larger group, followed by questions and answers and larger discussions. In this way, we gave attention to the showed question, how does this relate to our lives? While small and large group discussions were occurring, research assistants captured or harvested words, topics, and phrases that stood out or repeated themselves. These potential codes were written on cards by the research assistants. Cards were then integrated into a card game. Each youth was dealt 6 cards and asked to sort them in order from most important or relevant to least important or relevant. Working around the table, each youth then added the card they considered to be most important in the table. As more cards were added, youth were asked to place the cards with other cards, creating groups that belonged together. Once each youth had had a turn, we continued with the second most important cards, and then the third. As they positioned their cards, youth explained why they felt it belonged with a particular group. The other youth could then join in the discussion, resulting in a collective debate of where the code actually belonged and why it belonged there. After 3 rounds of youth placing cards on the table, youth would pass their cards to the person to their right, and we dealt an additional 3 cards to each youth. The process repeated itself until we felt we had fairly robust groups of codes. Groups of codes were then labeled with post-it notes reflecting initial ideas regarding themes. This entire process was repeated periodically throughout the analysis workshop. In order to understand the relationships between themes, we then placed code families and their respective theme labels on large sheets of paper on the floor. We used colored string to discuss and highlight the relationship between the various groups of codes. Bringing this all together, we were able to generate a theory regarding what youth need in order to be happy and healthy. Maintaining rigor through intercoder agreement was achieved through multiple approaches. Constant feedback on the Facebook walls, the development of codes as a group, the discussion around the meaning of codes, how they group together to form themes, where there are relationships and where there are tensions, all with youth participants at the center of these activities and the related analysis work. Producing the final report in step 6 of thematic analysis is akin to component 3 in Photovoice, dissemination. Consideration at this stage then becomes about ensuring that there is actionable uptake of these various final reports or dissemination products. Here, the arguments of authors such as Westmore Seuss and False-Borda become important signposts, reminding us not to impose the exclusionary language of academia and academic forums on the knowledge mobilization process. We are asked to ensure that knowledge is accessible by creating a space for participants to use the language and communication formats of their contexts and culture. Simultaneously, we have an ethical responsibility to ensure that we contribute to knowledge and ensure that findings disseminated to policymakers is done in ways that honor participant experiences and knowledge and will be taken seriously. In spaces and places, youth elected to make posters that reflected, for example, their pervasive need for their culture in their lives and the embodied nature of culture. They painted murals that drew attention to the importance of including youth in decision-making processes within the community, and murals that explain the holistic and integrated components of family, culture, self-esteem, and education, together with elders, friends, language, and nature in supporting positive outcomes for youth. As the Director of Mental Health Services in Eskasoni says, if staff are ever in doubt of the service model that they should be following, they can now just walk outside the building and look at the mural. All they need to know is right there. Videos showing and explaining the murals were created, allowing service providers and youth to share the findings beyond the immediate community. Posters have been distributed throughout communities and service provider offices. The messages contained in the posters have been made more mobile through the use of postcards and slideshows available on a project website. Postcards and website links can be shared, for example, with people in federal government offices by local mental health service providers. These postcards and slideshows have an accompanying two-page report explaining the findings that can also be shared with policymakers and funders. Posters informing practice have been produced and shared with other service providers. Youth have presented at various international conferences for service providers and people focused on strengths-based work with youth. To conclude, youth in the Spaces and Places project have engaged in a process of deep and critical reflection on their positioning in their communities, what they require from their communities to do well, and the ways in which communities can better support them in their cultural engagement. They have done this by utilizing relevant data gathering techniques, engaging in a rigorous data analysis process, and giving focused attention to who needs to hear their findings and how best this can be achieved. Through this process of critical reflection, youth have been able to contribute to our knowledge base on youth and their psychosocial outcomes, and engage in a process of knowledge mobilization aimed at bringing about resource change where necessary and or amplifying existing supports that are required. Because of this critical application of the Photovoice approach, irrespective of the questions posed to these young researchers, they are well positioned to provide astute and rigorous answers that honor their wisdom, knowledge, and efforts. Thank you. Yvette?
Thank you very much, Linda, for that wonderful presentation. And thank you very much to everyone for coming out today. Our next webinar will be on August 18th at 1 p.m. Mountain Daylight Time with David Morgan, and his topic will be Focus Groups Planning for Success. We also have the Qualitative Health Research Conference coming up in October, so you can go to our website, www.IIQM.ca, and check that out. Linda, do you have any final words?
None from my end. Just thank you again very much for the opportunity to be able to share our experiences.
All right. Thank you very much. So take care, everyone, and we'll see you hopefully in August.